Both Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig have been charged on suspicion of spying. The charges follow a BC court ruling in May that an extradition hearing for Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou can go ahead. The CBC's Catherine Cullen has more for us.
对加拿大籍被告人迈克尔斯帕福
It is bad news in the cases of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Already, it's been 5 months since Canadian officials could visit them in prison. Now they are both charged with spying for state secrets and intelligence. A spokesperson for China's foreign ministry was asked today by a Canadian reporter if the men could be punished with a life sentence or even death.
我不回答假设性的问题。
Okay, I don't answer hypothetical questions. This is just a public prosecution, and it is not yet sentenced.
It's still widely believed to be retaliation for Canada's arrest of Meng Wanzhou. The Chinese telecom executive is facing fraud charges in the U.S. Just last month, Meng's attempt to have her extradition stopped was rejected by a Canadian court.
We will continue to stand strong and firmly on the return of the two Michaels.
Canada has long insisted the release of the two men is a top priority. Today, the Prime Minister defended his efforts.
On top of the public positioning that we're always very firm on, there is also plenty of action behind the scenes in very direct and firm ways.
But it will be harder to get the two men out of China now that the trial process has begun, says this former ambassador.
It's all preordained. We know in China that once you are formally charged, you are found guilty 99.9% of the time.
Saint-Jacques is among those who say it's time for Canada to get tougher with China, though China has shown it's not afraid to retaliate against Canadian businesses or citizens when angered. Catherine Cullen, CBC News, Ottawa.
We did want to hear more from Canada's former ambassador to China. What do these charges mean for an already tense relationship between our country and China? And does Canada or the federal government need to change its stance on China? We reached Guy Saint-Jacques in Montreal. Hi, Mr. Saint-Jacques. Good to see you as always.
My pleasure.
The last time you were on the program, you had anticipated this step happening. I imagine you're not surprised that it formally did.
I'm not surprised, but of course it's a sad development for the two Michaels. It will complicate the task of the government, and I think it will make it almost impossible to extract them from China, because of course the Chinese will tell us now, don't ask us to intervene into a legal proceeding. Don't you know that we are a country governed by the rule of law?
You've been through something similar, right, with the Garretts. What was the process like behind the scenes? What do you imagine is happening behind the scenes now? Is it any different than what's been going on for the last 550 days?
Well, I think there are some similarities, of course, but some major differences. For instance, this is a much more complicated case because of the personality involved. Mrs. Meng, who is the daughter of Ren Zhengfei, and I think that there is a personal connection between him and the leader, Xi Jinping. And this is a file that is managed by Xi Jinping, who wants to punish Canada and serve this as an example for other countries that would dare to confront China. And so that means that now we will have to wait for the outcome. We have to hope to get consular access to the two Michaels, because there's been no consular access for the last 5 months. I suspect that the Chinese will say, because of these new occurrences of the COVID-19 disease in Beijing, that this consular access will not be allowed. I know that they will be able to see their lawyers only a few times, but in terms of the trial itself, it won't be a fair process, because their lawyers won't have access to the evidence, because the Chinese will say that it involves a state secret. So, and at the end of the day, we know that the minimum sentence would be 10 years, but based on the comments made earlier today by the spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I expect a much harsher sentence.
Why? Based on the comments that the Foreign Affairs Minister, we also heard from the ambassador today. What exactly in those comments leads you to have that feeling?
Well, Jolly Jiang, the spokesperson, said that these are very serious accusations. Again, we won't be able to see the full evidence. They won't reveal much, but and based also on my experience with Kevin Garrett, in the case of Kevin Garrett, he was found guilty because he had taken a few pictures of Chinese military in boats on the river between Dandong and North Korea. And the Chinese said those were secret military exercises, and you took pictures, so you knew that those were secret exercises, so therefore you're contravening the national security law, and he was found guilty on that basis. And in the case of Michael Spavor, he is a close friend of Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. China has been very upset with that because for them, North Korea is their backyard. They don't want foreigners to be involved, and so it's clear that they had been watching him for some time. And I assume that Mr. Spavor has spoken with a number of foreigners about his encounters with Kim Jong-un. In the case of Michael Kovrig, of course, we know that much of his interrogation dealt with the work that he did when he was at the embassy. And of course, this involved looking at China's relations with its neighbors like Russia, India, or North Korea. And all those relations are considered very sensitive for China. Furthermore, the definition of national security in China is very broad, very elastic, and you don't have to do much to be found guilty. So I think because of the work that Michael Kovrig did, including after when he went to work for that NGO, I think that we have to expect a very tough sentence.
The Foreign Affairs Minister was on the show a few weeks ago talking about how they had requested even virtual consular visits and so far been denied. What mechanisms does the government have available to them, if any, moving forward? We've spoken in the past, Mr. Saint-Jacques, about their efforts to sort of rally international attention to this and increase international pressure on China beyond, Ms. Meng's case disappearing. What mechanisms do they have?
Well, I think the only part of the strategy that has worked has been to rally support from other countries. And I think that we should continue to ask countries to speak on our behalf, to say that it's totally unacceptable that we have not been able to have access. And it's very easy to organize a video conference or at least a phone call. I think this is totally unacceptable. And, I would hope that other countries would speak on that. Furthermore, I think that we are at the stage where the federal government has to take this coordination with other countries to a new level where we could develop common responses to Chinese behavior. And each time we see something happening where China wants to punish a country, we should react. A case in point is Australia, when Prime Minister Morrison called for a full and independent inquiry on the COVID-19 pandemic. China imposed tariffs of 60% on export of Australian barley, and they cut the beef export. I think there should have been an outcry of Western countries to say this is unacceptable, and we should do this every time. The message to China should be, we have no problem with you being an important player on the international scene, as long as you play by the rules and as long as you stop this hostage diplomacy and acting as a bully.
The one complicating factor, and I just have about a minute left, is the United States, of course, and its complicated relationship with China. John Bolton, the former national security advisor to the president, has a new book out today. Or sorry, it's supposed to come out soon, rather, I should say. Some pages were leaked, and the CBC has seen them, that talk about this case. And in particular, he says that he and others tried to assure Canadian officials that the United States would support Canada at every step. From your perspective, has that happened?
No, and in fact, Trump lost a golden opportunity when they signed the phase one of the trade deal. China was desperate for that deal. I think he could have extracted concessions from them. And Trump does not like Canada. He does not like our leader. He is just thinking about himself and his re-election. So let's hope that the next administration will be more forthcoming.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Mr. Saint-Jacques. Pleasure to have you with us as always.
Thank you for the invitation.
We want to bring in now Robert Malley. He's president and CEO at the International Crisis Group, the company for which Michael Kovrig was working as a senior advisor at the time of his detention. He joins us from Washington. Hi, Mr. Malley. Good to see you. I wish it were under different circumstances.
Same here.
First, I know that this was to a certain degree anticipated, but it's still a big deal. How are you doing, and what can you tell us about Mr. Kovrig?
Well, thank you. I mean, it was a tough day for Michael's family, first and foremost, with whom we are in regular touch, and for all our colleagues at Crisis Group, many of whom have worked closely with Michael for years. As you say, this is both shocking and sadly quite expected, because the case from the outset has been a political case. And as long as China feels like the case of its citizen in Canada isn't resolved, they will play with the life of and the freedom of Michael Kovrig, which is obviously unacceptable, but that's what they're doing.
As I mentioned, just coming into your interview, there have been no my understanding, at least the last we've heard from the federal government, is that since the outset of the pandemic, there's been no consular access granted, and that China is still essentially saying that because of the pandemic and some more recent outbreaks, they still can't get any access. Is that accurate from what you know?
From everything we know, but what we know from the Canadian government and from the embassy in Beijing, and from what we know, they've not had any consular access since January. It used to be once a month, and you could imagine, since he has no contact with his family, save for one phone call in the last 557 days, you could imagine, that last contact with the outside world, which Michael Kovrig used to have, he has not now had since January, and we very much hope that the Chinese government will change that.
So he's only had one call with his family in those 557 days?
Correct.
I can't even imagine what this is like for his family.
Well, you're right, and nor can I. I know that they've shown unbelievable strength, fortitude, and they're fighting every day the way one would expect from a family. But they've been great in terms of coordinating efforts with the Canadian government, with us, with the U.S. government, and just doing everything they can so that Michael can be reunited with them as soon as possible.
We've talked about Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor in this case a lot on the show, but for people who maybe aren't super familiar with it, right now, he faces a charge of espionage, essentially. What was he doing for you? What did his work what was it comprised of?
Right. So the charge is ludicrous, because the work that Michael was doing, which really is the work that all of our analysts around the globe at Crisis Group do, which is to be transparent. The whole purpose of our work is to talk to officials and non-officials, try to get their sense of their perspective on deadly conflicts around the world, and then try to come up with ideas which we share with them about how they, in this case China, could play a role in trying to resolve or prevent deadly conflict that either affects it directly or in which it might have a role to play. And Michael had been doing that. Not only was he transparent about his effort, not only was he very open, but he was received by Chinese officials. They would invite him to conferences, they invite him to meetings. So the notion that anything he was doing was either endangering Chinese national security or divulging state secrets is absurd on its face. And again, I don't need to say this, but I will. He was picked up 10 days after Ms. Meng was arrested in Canada on charges of extradition to the U.S. He was picked up even though he'd been traveling, as I say, regularly to China. And he was picked up because he was a Canadian who happened to be in Beijing at the wrong time.
And it's not like, I should make this clear to our audience, it's not like they produced any evidence today, or they said, here are the specifics of why we're charging Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor with these very serious charges. They talked at length about how serious it was, but there's no evidence out in the public or otherwise.
No, and again, the work he did, I don't know what they have in mind. I think it almost is a diversion to start talking about the legalities of this case, because this is a political case that's masquerading as a judicial one. It's political. It's been political from the very beginning, and for the past 557 days, it's remained political, and its resolution will be political as well.
When you say resolution, this is a hugely political subject here in this country as well. To what degree should the government be pushing back against China? What should they be saying publicly? All of that is discussed and debated very frequently in the House of Commons and probably outside of it as well. From your perspective, when you say the resolution will be political, what do you think? What do you mean?
Well, what I mean is that Michael has become a pawn in a much bigger game, a pawn, unwittingly in a game between, or pawn, tug of war between China, Canada, and the United States. So there's nothing having to do with what he has done, one way or another, that's going to affect this case. Now, we think it's going to be a mix of pressure, sending a clear message to China that it is acting in ways that are going to undermine its own interests around the world. If it has this chilling effect on anyone who wants to travel there, knowing that from one day to the next they could be picked up arbitrarily because China wants to use them as leverage in some other case. So that's number one. And number two, yes, there's going to have to be discussions, as we know there have been, between Canada, China, the U.S. and China, to see how this case could be resolved, so that from our perspective, the goal is to get Michael Kovrig back home as soon as possible. There obviously are other interests involved, but we're focused on that one, as is his family. And, one thing I'll say, the Canadian government, we know that they've made this a priority. Michael is a Canadian citizen. He was a Canadian diplomat, so they don't need us or his family to tell them how important and urgent this case is. And we have worked very closely with them. Of course, we'll always encourage them to do everything they're doing and more to make sure that he's reunited with his family as soon as possible.
A big part of what they've told us their strategy is, and what they've talked about, is increasing the concerted pressure put on by a myriad of countries, so the international, basically, pressure placed on China. Do you think other countries have stepped up to the plate to the degree that they should?
It's hard to know, because I'm sure a lot of these conversations take place behind closed doors. A lot of them have issued statements. They've told us at our request, and at the Canadian government and Michael's family's request, they have told us that they've raised it every time they meet with Chinese officials. Now, we know that there are other issues that they have to deal with, and so it may not be the first thing on their mind, but as long as Michael is detained, we think it's important for every country to make that point, because it's Michael today who knows who will be next. If China believes that, or any country believes for that matter, that the way to get its way is to hold citizens of another country as pawns, as hostage in a broader political struggle. So we think it's in their interest. They have all told us that they agree with that, all the ones that we've reached out to. And we hope that they continue to raise it and make it an even higher priority.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks again for your time this evening, Mr. Malley. Like I said, I really wish it were under different circumstances.
Appreciate that.
How should we interpret the timing of these formal charges, and what happens next? Sida Liu is an associate professor of sociology and law at the University of Toronto. Professor Liu is an expert in Chinese law and joins me now from New York. Hi there, Professor. Good to see you. Thank you for making time for us.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to ask you some, procedural questions first, if you don't mind. We know that the charges have now been levied or brought against Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. What is the next step?
The next step is the prosecution file will go to the courts very soon. If I understand correctly, the two Michaels are being charged in two different courts, one in Beijing, one in Liaoning province in the northeast. So they will go to two different courts, but probably almost simultaneously. And then afterwards, each court would have normally 3 months to conduct a criminal trial. But of course, in this case, because it's a case involving national security, also with the possibility of all the way up to the death penalty as the sentence, it can be automatically extended for another 3 months. So in 6 months, the court is supposed to finish the trial. But of course, there are also other ways they could extend the period. I mean, they could pause the trial, send the case back to the prosecution if necessary.
Let me ask you a bit about the trial, because I've read some of your analysis in, for example, the case of Mr. Schellenberg. And is it correct to assume that these trials will not be done in a very transparent way? It's not like there's going to be, TV cameras in there or anything like that.
Absolutely not. Especially this case is even, I think, less likely to have any kind of transparency than the Schellenberg case, because Schellenberg case is a drug case, right? So this case is, both these two Michaels, their two cases are national security charges, very serious charges regarding state secrets. So according to the criminal procedure law in China, these trials are totally closed door. So there will be no reporters in the room, nobody basically observing the trial except for the defendants, the lawyers, the prosecutors, and the judges.
You mentioned the severity of the charges. How serious are they viewed there? And in particular, I mean, obviously by the government in China as probably some of the most serious charges. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I think both of them are charged under the criminal law, the crime of espionage, basically about spying on state secret and giving the state secret to foreign entities. So if that's the case, I think according to the criminal law, if they were convicted, the sentence will be at least 5 years, more likely 10 years or longer. If it's very serious, could be goes all the way to life in prison or even death penalty.
And when I've also read in your analysis that the use of the death penalty as a punishment has decreased over time in China, and there are a variety of reasons rather for that. What is your anticipation here? Would it be an extreme scenario if they were to convict and punish with the death penalty?
It's hard to say because we know very little about the actual details. You know, what did they actually do, and on what ground they were, what facts, based on what facts they were charged, and under these crimes. So it's really hard to predict what's going to happen based on the very limited information we have. But as you said, I mean, the use of death penalty in China has been declining. China still gives probably more death penalty than any other country in the world. So at this point, we just don't know. It's hard to make any prediction based on the very limited facts we have.
Can you talk a little bit about the political dynamics of this? Because again, I've read your analysis on the times during which China uses the justice system or cases like this to essentially prove a point. If they are proving a point here or trying to send a message, what is it?
So it's, of course, legally speaking, these two charges against the two Michaels have nothing to do with the Meng Wanzhou case in Vancouver, right? But as we all know, I mean, these are politically connected. I mean, it's very, especially the timing of their detention, their arrest, their prosecution, and now the case is going to trial, all kind of corresponds to the Meng case in various ways. And China is also not very, China is also very kind of almost straightforward in kind of connecting these two cases politically. So my sense is that what's going to happen is really contingent upon what will happen to Ms. Meng's case in Vancouver. And they could make the trial a lot slower, just wait for the next step in the Meng case. Or they could, if they want, push the case much faster.
The former ambassador, Canada's former ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques, has said on this program that once charged, there's something like a 99% chance of conviction once the prosecution has begun. Do you think that's, do you share in that assessment?
Yes, but it's not unique to China. I mean, because China is a civil law country. I mean, if you look at Japan, Taiwan, many civil law jurisdictions, once the case actually is charged by the prosecutors, goes to the criminal trial, the conviction rate is extremely high. So in the case of China, it's certainly higher than 99%. So at this point, it's almost certain, I think, if unless the prosecutors decide to withdraw the prosecution, if the case goes to a judicial decision, it's very likely they will be convicted.
Is there anything in particular, Professor, that you're watching for over the next number of weeks or months, something that we should be keeping our eyes open for?
Well, I guess the very first thing, I mean, we should be looking for more facts. You know, what facts are there? Yeah. Any facts. Like they were based on what they were charged with these very serious crimes. And another thing I think we should be looking for is kind of who will be the lawyers representing them, right? Because I mean, I think before the COVID-19 situation, they were given access to lawyers for a few months. I mean, from the time they were transferred to the stage of prosecution, they were having access to lawyers. But after COVID-19 happened, they haven't been able to see lawyers. So now the case is going to trial. Presumably, they will have defense counsel. So it will be very interesting to see who will be the lawyers representing them and what kind of arguments these lawyers can make in court.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Professor Liu. Pleasure to have you with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.